On a quiet stretch of Texas backroads in the spring of 1988, 6 men disappeared within weeks of each other. Not in a city, not during a riot, not in a war between gangs or cartels. By the time summer arrived, their names were spoken only in lowered voices, and no official report could explain why the county suddenly learned to watch itself. The people responsible were not outsiders. They were not organized criminals. They were not looking for power, money, or territory. They were the Bennett cousins, 2 men raised side by side, living at the edge of a county that preferred silence over answers, a household no one paid attention to, a family with one unspoken rule, and a line that should never have been crossed. Texas authorities would later classify the events as unrelated disappearances. Locals would call it something else entirely, not a massacre, not a revenge spree, a correction. The cause wasn't drugs, wasn't money, wasn't history repeating itself. It was one careless act, done in the wrong place, against the wrong family, and a decision that turned ordinary men into something the county never forgot. Before we continue with the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Texas, spring of 1988. The kind of spring that looks calm on the surface and hides rot underneath. The county didn't have a name people remembered. It was one of those places you only pass through if you're running from something or heading nowhere. 2 highways cut across it like scars. Gas stations leaned toward bankruptcy, and the land stretched flat enough to make men feel small without trying. That's where the Bennetts lived. They weren't brothers. They were cousins, raised close enough that the difference never mattered. Same last name, same blood pressure, same quiet way of watching people before speaking. If you passed them on the road, you wouldn't remember their faces. That was the point. Clay Bennett was the older one by 4 years. Lean, sun-dried, eyes that never stopped measuring distance. He worked fencing crews and odd construction jobs across 3 counties. Marcus Bennett was thicker, slower to speak, harder to read. He fixed engines, tractors, anything that burned fuel and refused to behave. They shared a small house at the edge of the county line. Not because they had to, but because it was easier. Easier to keep things simple, easier to keep outsiders guessing, and easier to protect what was theirs. The dog had been with the family longer than either of them could remember. Nobody recalled exactly when it arrived. It just existed, always near the porch, always alert, always silent unless something crossed a line. The Bennetts never called it a pet. They called it the dog, as if naming it would soften something they didn't want softened. On a Friday night in late April, the county filled with strangers, oil crews passing through, truckers chasing shortcuts, men with loud voices and no memory of where they'd been an hour earlier. They gathered at a roadside bar that barely passed inspection and stayed open because nothing else was close. That's where the line was crossed. No one could agree later on exactly what happened. Some said it was a joke. Some said the men were drunk. Others said they were bored and looking for something to break. But the end result was the same. By the time Clay and Marcus got home, the dog was alive, but it was no longer whole. They didn't scream. They didn't rush it to town. They didn't call anyone. They sat on the porch until the sun rose, listening to breathing that came too slow and too shallow. When it stopped, neither cousin moved. They stayed there long after there was nothing left to stay for. By noon, the bar was still loud. Laughter covered what had happened the night before. Men talked too freely. Names were dropped casually. Someone bragged. Someone exaggerated. The Bennetts listened. That was the first mistake made by the county, assuming silence meant weakness. Clay wrote nothing down. Marcus didn't need reminders. They already knew where the men drank, where they parked, which roads they avoided at night, and which ones they trusted too much. This wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves mistakes behind. This was something slower. Over the next 3 days, the Bennetts changed their routine just enough to notice who noticed them. They filled the truck at different stations. They ate at odd hours. They drove roads nobody used unless they had something to hide. Texas, in 1988, still had places maps forgot. The first man disappeared on a Tuesday. He was last seen leaving the bar alone, telling someone he had a shortcut home. His truck was found 2 days later, nose down in a dry ditch, keys still in the ignition, radio quietly playing static. No blood, no signs of struggle, just absence. The sheriff called it a drinking accident. That explanation satisfied people who wanted sleep more than truth. The Bennetts didn't celebrate. They didn't speak about it. They simply moved to the next name because there were 5 more, and none of them understood what kind of line they had crossed. Because in that part of Texas, there were rules that never made it into law books, and the Bennetts had been raised to enforce them. By the second disappearance, the county stopped pretending nothing was wrong. Men still laughed at the bar, But the laughter didn't last as long. Glasses stayed closer to the table. Engines were left running. People checked the parking lot twice before stepping outside. Fear doesn't announce itself. It leaks into behavior. The sheriff adjusted his language. The first man had been a drunk who wandered off. The second was likely transient. By the third week, the word missing started showing up in reports. Clay Bennett noticed the change before anyone else did. He could hear it in how people spoke. Quieter, shorter sentences, too many pauses. Texas men didn't pause unless something was wrong. Marcus noticed it in the engines. Cars came into his shop with nothing mechanically broken. Starters worked. Fuel lines were clean. But men asked him to check everything anyway. They wanted reassurance machines couldn't give. The second man vanished on a Thursday. He had been careful, or thought he was, parked closer to the bar, left with company, talked about staying at a motel instead of driving. But alcohol creates confidence without awareness, and confidence loosens habits. He took the wrong road. That road ran past land nobody claimed anymore. Old fencing collapsed into itself. Mesquite trees bent like they were listening. If you drove it long enough, the county disappeared behind you. The truck was never found. That detail bothered the sheriff more than the first disappearance. Vehicles didn't just vanish, not without effort. The Bennetts didn't rush. They waited days between movements, let the county reset, let rumors blur facts. Every disappearance was spaced just far enough apart to feel unrelated, until they weren't. They never used the same location twice. Never used the same method twice. Patterns were for amateurs. By the third man, people started talking about animals. Coyotes, feral hogs, snakes. Texas loved explanations that didn't involve other people. Nature was easier to blame. Nature didn't sit in bars. Nature didn't answer questions. But this wasn't nature. The third man disappeared after sunrise. That was new. He had been sober. He had children. He had told someone he was heading straight home. His wife waited with the porch light on until it burned out. When his boots were found 3 days later, placed neatly beside a cattle gate, the county went quiet. Not panicked, not screaming, quiet. The kind of quiet that means people are thinking the same thought but don't want to say it first. Someone was hunting. The sheriff called in 2 deputies from the next county. They drove the roads, asked the same questions everyone had already answered, and wrote notes they couldn't connect to anything solid. No witnesses, no bodies, no crime scenes. Just 6 names spoken less and less often. Clay and Marcus kept their routine. That mattered. People expect killers to change. They expect agitation, sloppiness, signs. But the Bennetts had been raised around men who worked injured, mourned quietly, and never explained themselves. They were invisible because they behaved like everyone else. At night, Clay walked the property line with a flashlight he rarely turned on. Marcus checked locks that didn't need checking. The house stayed dark. Radios stayed off. They didn't talk about what they were doing. They didn't need to. By the 4th disappearance, the bar lost business. Truckers avoided it. Oil crews drank elsewhere. Locals went home early. The owner scrubbed the floors harder than necessary, as if cleanliness could erase memory. The 4th man had been the loudest. The kind of man who fills silence because he can't stand it. The kind who believes noise is dominance. When he didn't show up for work, nobody was surprised. When he didn't answer his phone for days, people started lying to themselves. When his wallet was found, empty, clean, placed on a church bench, nobody touched it. The preacher called the sheriff. The sheriff stood there too long, staring at something that felt deliberate. This wasn't chaos. This was communication. The county understood something then. Whoever was doing this wasn't trying to hide forever. They were sending a message, but only to the people who already knew what it meant. Clay and Marcus had crossed a point of no return by then, not because of the bodies, but because the county had begun to watch itself. Neighbors stopped trusting neighbors. Men measured their words. Nobody joked about animals anymore. And still, the Bennetts waited, because there were 2 names left, and rushing would cheapen what had already been paid for in blood. By the time the 5th name started circulating, the county understood something it had never learned how to say out loud. Distance no longer meant safety. In Texas, roads were supposed to protect you. Long stretches of asphalt, open land, nothing to hide behind. If trouble came, you saw it early. If someone followed you, you knew. That belief had kept men careless for generations. Now it was failing. The 5th man didn't drink at the bar anymore. He had stopped going out after the 3rd disappearance. He filled his truck before sunset, paid in cash, and drove with the radio off. He locked his doors the moment he sat down. He told himself he was being smart enough to survive. What he didn't understand was that survival wasn't about habits anymore. It was about timing. timing, and timing had already been taken from him. He vanished on a road locals called the Straight Mile. No curves, no trees, just flat land and sky. If something happened there, it meant someone wanted it to. His truck was found just before dawn, doors closed, no damage, no blood. The headlights were still on, illuminating nothing. When the sheriff stood beside it, he felt exposed in a way his badge had never prepared him for. Whoever did this wasn't afraid of light. They weren't afraid of witnesses. They were choosing when to be seen. That scared him more than violence. The Bennetts followed the news the same way everyone else did, quietly, indirectly, never too close to the source. Clay listened while buying feed. Marcus listened while fixing a tractor that didn't need repairs. They didn't need updates. They already knew how many were left. The county responded the only way it knew how, by tightening in on itself. Men started traveling in pairs. Phone calls replaced bar conversations. People memorized license plates that didn't belong. The roads filled with suspicion. Not patrols, not checkpoints, just eyes. Eyes that couldn't stop what was coming. The sheriff considered calling state investigators. He even picked up the phone once, put it back down. He had no bodies, no scenes, no proof of a crime beyond absence and implication. And he knew something else, though he didn't want to admit it. If outsiders came in, they wouldn't leave any better answers behind. They would just make people talk, and talking was dangerous. The Bennetts didn't speak to each other that week unless necessary. There was nothing left to plan. The paths had already been walked in their minds long before the first disappearance. Marcus cleaned tools that were already clean. Clay checked the truck twice before driving it, then checked it again after parking. Everything stayed controlled. Everything stayed deliberate. This was the stage where mistakes usually happened. Excitement, fear, ego, but the Bennetts felt none of those. What they felt was weight, not guilt, weight. The kind that settles into your bones and changes how you stand. The kind that doesn't ask permission. The kind you accept because the alternative is letting something rot unfinished. The fifth disappearance broke something fragile in the county. People stopped using shortcuts entirely. Businesses closed earlier. The bar put up a handwritten sign claiming temporary renovations. Nobody believed it. Nobody questioned it. At night, the road stayed empty, except for one truck. The sixth man had learned too late. He stayed close to town, slept with a pistol nearby, called his brother every night before bed. He even spoke to the sheriff once, casually, as if asking questions could erase memory. The sheriff had looked at him longer than necessary, said nothing. The last man disappeared without drama. No abandoned vehicle, no misplaced belongings, no signal. He simply failed to arrive somewhere he was expected and never corrected the mistake. By then, the county didn't panic. It exhaled. 6 names, 6 absences, no replacements. The sheriff filed his final report with language so vague it almost felt like an apology. He used phrases like unconfirmed, no evidence, insufficient cause. He told himself he was being professional. Deep down, he knew he was being careful, because some things, once acknowledged officially, demanded answers that no one wanted to give. Clay and Marcus buried the dog behind the house after it was over. Not immediately. They waited weeks, let the ground settle, let the county return to something resembling normal. The hole was deeper than necessary. Neither commented on it. They didn't mark the spot. They didn't talk about the men. Life didn't improve after that. It didn't need to. Improvement had never been the goal. Things simply returned to their previous shape. Quiet, restrained, watchful. The bar reopened under new management. Different faces passed through. Different voices tested the air. No one crossed lines anymore, at least not openly. The county learned without lessons being written down, and the Bennetts went back to being what they had always been. 2 men no one noticed, in a place that remembered everything. The summer after the disappearances arrived quietly, like it didn't want to remind anyone it was there. Heat settled into the county and stayed. Dust clung to windows. Conversations shortened again, not from fear this time, but from habit. People had learned that too much talking created echoes, and echoes had a way of returning when you didn't want them to. On paper, everything looked normal. No new missing persons, no arrests, no investigations reopened, but counties don't reset. They absorb. Every place carries forward what happens inside it, even when no one agrees on the story, especially then. The sheriff noticed it first in small things. He had been re-elected without opposition, which should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like avoidance. People didn't want change. They wanted continuity, a familiar face to guard a silence they all shared. He stopped patrolling the Straight Mile, not officially. He just found reasons not to drive it. He told himself it was superstition, then stopped telling himself anything at all. Some roads were better left unvisited. At the bar, the jokes never came back. New patrons sensed it immediately. They could feel something off in the walls, in the way locals watched newcomers talk too loudly or laugh too freely. There was an invisible boundary now, one nobody explained. Men corrected each other when stories got exaggerated. Women pulled children closer without knowing why. Dogs weren't touched anymore, not even teased. It wasn't fear that enforced the rule. It was memory. Clay Bennett felt it in his body before he ever noticed it around town. He woke up earlier than before, not from nightmares, he didn't have those, but from a pressure behind his eyes that told him sleep was finished. Marcus started working longer hours for no reason. Engines didn't break more often, people didn't pay better, but staying busy kept his hands from remembering weight and texture they no longer needed to recall. They didn't speak about what happened. They didn't need to, but silence, like heat, changes things slowly. Clay began walking the perimeter of the property again, same as before, only now he noticed how the land felt altered. The trees hadn't moved, the fence hadn't changed, but the space between things carried something heavier. Texas soil remembers pressure. Marcus fixed a truck one afternoon that belonged to a man from 2 counties over. The man talked too much, asked too many questions, mentioned the disappearances as if they were campfire stories. Marcus listened, finished the repair, took the money, said nothing. When the man drove away, Marcus realized his hands were shaking. That bothered him, not because of fear, but because it meant something had followed him back into ordinary life, something he had assumed would stay contained. The county itself began to fracture in small, untraceable ways. Families moved sooner than planned. Businesses closed without explanation. Old men stopped sitting outside in the evenings. Nothing dramatic enough to record, just erosion. People from outside asked questions occasionally. Journalists sniffed around for a story that refused to take shape. Without bodies, without witnesses, without conflict, there was nothing to sell. The county learned how to deflect. Drifters, they said. Hard living, they said. Texas, they said. That word covered everything. Clay noticed the dog's absence most at dusk. That was when it used to rise, stretch, check the horizon. Now there was only quiet, and quiet, when prolonged, starts to speak. He found himself replaying details he hadn't thought mattered. Sounds, timing, the way the air felt before decisions were made. Not regret, analysis. His mind wanted closure. His environment refused to provide. Marcus, meanwhile, began dreaming. Not about the men, about roads. Endless roads that didn't lead anywhere. Roads that folded back into themselves. Roads with no shoulders to pull over on. He woke up exhausted, annoyed at a weakness he didn't recognize as one. They never discussed leaving. Leaving would suggest escape, and nothing they had done felt like something that could be outrun. The sheriff retired early. No speech, no celebration, just a quiet announcement in the local paper. He moved closer to his daughter, told people he wanted to see his grandkids grow up. What he didn't say was that he was tired of guarding a truth no one wanted named. His replacement was younger, cleaner, eager, but he inherited the same silence. Every time he asked about 1988, conversations closed politely. Not hostile, just finished. He learned quickly what questions shortened careers. The county had absorbed the event and converted it into something else. A boundary, a warning, a memory that didn't need retelling. Clay and Marcus aged into that memory without noticing the transition. They became part of the landscape, not as men, but as constants. The kind of presence people factor in subconsciously, like weather or terrain. Nobody accused them, nobody defended them. They existed in a space beyond explanation, and that was the real cost. Not the lives taken, not the violence enacted, but the way everything afterward bent slightly, never returning to its original shape. The county moved on, but it never forgot. Time didn't heal anything. It only redistributed the weight. By the early 1990s, the county looked unchanged to anyone passing through. Same roads, same fences, same wide skies that made people feel honest, just for standing under them. Outsiders saw peace. Locals saw maintenance. Clay Bennett felt the first crack during an ordinary morning. He was repairing a section of fence that had collapsed under its own age. Not weather, not cattle, just rot doing what rot eventually does. His hands worked automatically, muscle memory guiding movements he'd performed 1,000 times, but something was off. He couldn't stop counting. Posts, stretches of wire, breaths. The numbers repeated, looping back on themselves. refusing to settle. Clay stopped, stood up straight, and scanned the land like something was approaching. Nothing was there. That was the problem. Marcus experienced it differently. His shop stayed busy, but his tolerance thinned. Engines that refused to cooperate irritated him more than they should have. Customers' voices scraped. Questions felt invasive, even when they weren't. One afternoon, a teenager laughed while Marcus was working beneath a hood. Just a laugh, not aimed at him, not mocking. Marcus slammed the hood down hard enough to bend the latch. The kid went silent. So did Marcus. He stepped back, stared at the damage, and felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Not anger, not fear, but recognition. The same tightening he'd felt years earlier, just before things became irreversible. That night, neither cousin slept. They didn't talk about it in the morning, but silence has a way of changing tone when it's been stretched too long. Clay began avoiding town. Not deliberately, just gradually. Supplies were stocked less often. Errands were combined. Faces became less familiar, which was safer than noticing who remembered him. Marcus, on the other hand, stayed closer than ever. He volunteered repairs, helped neighbors without being asked, made himself useful in visible ways. It wasn't penance, it was camouflage. The county watched them the way it always had, indirectly, without focus. People didn't suspect the Bennetts. Suspicion requires curiosity. What the county felt was acceptance. They belonged to the silence. But silence doesn't protect against time. Clay's body started betraying him first. Not illness, wear. His hands stiffened in the mornings. Old injuries complained louder. The land didn't care how much he had carried for it. One evening, as the sun fell low and red, Clay found himself standing at the spot where they had buried the dog. He hadn't intended to go there. His feet had simply chosen. The ground looked ordinary. No marker, no depression. Just soil and grass doing what they do, when undisturbed long enough. Clay stood there longer than he meant to, waiting for something he couldn't name. Nothing came. That absence unsettled him more than any memory. Marcus's dreams worsened. The roads returned, but now they ended abruptly. Drop-offs, dead ends, gates that wouldn't open. He woke with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Once he dreamed of the bar, empty, silent, lights still on. He was alone inside it, surrounded by chairs turned upside down on tables. The laughter was gone, but its echo lingered, warped and distant. He woke knowing the dream wasn't about the men. It was about containment. The county began changing again, subtly. New families moved in. Old ones aged out. Children grew up without knowing why certain jokes died on people's tongues before being finished. They inherited the rules without learning their origin. That's how warnings survive. One afternoon, a man from out of state knocked on the Bennett's door. He wore clean boots, drove a rental car, introduced himself as a writer, said he was researching regional disappearances. His smile was practiced, careful not to offend. Clay listened. Marcus stood behind him, silent. The man spoke for 5 minutes before realizing he wasn't being invited inside. When Clay finally answered, it was with one sentence. "You're late." The writer didn't understand what that meant, but he understood the tone. He left shortly after, tires kicking dust as he reversed down the drive. Neither cousin watched him go. That night, Marcus poured 2 glasses of whiskey. They drank in silence. It was the first time they had acknowledged the past without naming it. No confession, no validation, just shared recognition that whatever they had done hadn't ended. It had settled, and settled things still apply pressure. Clay realized then that the hunt had never been about the 6 men. It had been about restoring a balance that no longer existed, and balance, once forced, never holds on its own. They had changed the county, but the county had changed them back. Slower, heavier, less forgiving. The realization didn't break them. It hardened something already dense. Because the final truth was this: there would be no reckoning, no trial, no absolution, no closure, only continuation. And continuation is its own sentence. The land outlived the story. It always did. By the late 1990s, the county had folded the events of 1988 into itself so completely that even memory stopped resisting. What had once felt sharp became dull. What had once been heavy became structural, like beams inside a house no one thought about unless they failed. They never did. Clay Bennett aged quietly. No dramatic decline, no long illness. Just a gradual narrowing of motion, a slower rise from chairs, a longer pause before stepping outside in the morning. The land still recognized him. That mattered more than people did. Marcus carried on longer than expected. His body stayed strong, but his patience thinned to almost nothing. He spoke less. When he did, his words were exact, edged, never wasted. People learned not to fill silence around him. Neither cousin ever left. Leaving would have suggested an unfinished task, and nothing in their lives felt unresolved, only heavy. The house remained unchanged. Same porch, same cracks in the walls, same view of the horizon that didn't promise anything beyond continuity. The land didn't reward loyalty, but it acknowledged it. That was enough. The county's younger generation grew up without context. They heard fragments, half-jokes, warnings without origins, phrases that ended early. Dogs were treated carefully, outsiders were watched politely. Certain roads were avoided without explanation. Rules without stories last longer. The bar changed owners twice more. Its name changed. Its walls were repainted. But the energy never fully returned. Laughter remained measured. Confidence stayed tempered. The place learned restraint the way a body learns after injury. No one talked about the Bennetts. They didn't need to. Clay died on a winter morning with no witnesses. Marcus found him sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, posture upright. It looked intentional, not staged, just settled. Marcus didn't call anyone for hours. When he finally did, his voice didn't shake. The burial was small, local, unremarkable to anyone watching from a distance. Marcus stood alone most of the time, nodding politely, accepting condolences without absorbing them. Afterward, he returned to the house and sat on the porch until dark. That night, he dreamed of nothing, which felt like mercy. Marcus outlived Clay by 7 years. He worked until his hands stopped cooperating. When that happened, he closed the shop without ceremony. No sale, no announcement. Just a locked door and a handwritten sign that said closed. People nodded when they saw it. That's how endings happened in the county, quietly, without witnesses. In his final years, Marcus walked the land daily, not to patrol, not to remember, just to move through space that still recognized him. The pressure inside him had never disappeared, but it had redistributed itself into something manageable. Weight you learn to carry stops feeling like punishment. One evening, near dusk, Marcus stopped at the unmarked spot behind the house. The ground looked the same as it always had, grass grown back evenly, no sign of disturbance, no sign of reverence either, just earth doing what earth does when left alone. Marcus stood there longer than necessary, not to mourn, to confirm. He nodded once, not in approval, not in regret, and walked back toward the house. Marcus Bennett died during a heat wave, alone, window open, no sign of struggle. The county handled it efficiently. Paperwork, burial, property transfer. No investigations, no questions. The house was eventually sold. The land passed hands. New owners built fences, painted walls, planted things that didn't last. They complained about soil that felt stubborn, about land that resisted shaping. Texas doesn't forget pressure. The county continued. New names filled the census. Old names faded. Roads were repaved. Cell towers appeared. But some habits never changed. People still watched how others treated animals. They still corrected jokes that went too far. They still believed certain lines existed, even if they couldn't explain why. Nothing like 1988 ever happened again. Not because it couldn't, but because it didn't need to. The story survived without being told. That was its final form. No justice, no condemnation, no redemption. Just a quiet understanding passed from one generation to the next. Some boundaries are enforced once and remembered forever. And Texas, as it always had, kept moving.